As promised, we're being joined on the line right now by Congressman Jody Hice. Congressman, welcome back to the program.
Always great to be with you, Jerome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's I don't know how much of that you heard, but I did want to just get your thoughts briefly on again the situation in which we see. I remember it's awful anytime someone's life is senselessly taken. But I remember the shooting death of a 16-year-old girl in Atlanta over the Christmas weekend, and it sort of capped what became a homicide rate in that city that was the highest in 2 decades. And then just a couple days before this new year, Congressman, a 7-year-old girl in Georgia was killed. Crime rates in Atlanta spiked to historic levels, and Mayor Keisha Lance-Bottom, she's constantly on the TV, and she gets a lot of national praise. But the expectation, Congressman, the scrutiny never actually falls at her feet when you have a situation in which, from what I can tell, just again looking at the crime data. And the same is to be said about Savannah, which also saw an increase in homicides in 2020. The expectation on these leaders in these cities is lower than it is for the police, who are simply trying to do the best job that they can do in preventing these crimes.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I would say, certainly the issue is rising violent crime in Atlanta, but I would venture to say probably every blue city in the country is seeing an increase in crime, and that's because they have embraced a basic philosophy that is erroneous of somehow it's a good idea to defund the police or attack the police, discredit the police, and somehow that's supposed to help reduce crime. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Of course, we need to deal with bad actors who may be in law enforcement. Bad actors are in every segment of business and society, for that matter, and they need to be dealt with. But the vast majority of law enforcement personnel are trying to keep communities safe. We need to celebrate them and help them and come to their aid rather than try to defund them and criticize them and in every way discredit them. And so that's what we're seeing in Atlanta. That's what we're seeing in other cities. And as a result, we're seeing more crime.
Yeah, I touched on the fact that there's a mayoral race in New York City, and a majority of Democratic voters in that city place COVID-19 as the number one issue, Congressman, facing the city, and then crime and violence is the number 2 issue. Police reform is near the bottom of the list, and so it doesn't matter what party you belong in. If you're just a person who comports yourself with common sense, to me, you know the reality on the ground and what the real issues facing your community is. I appreciate your comments on that. I do want to switch gears here. I guess essentially for the reason that we brought you on, and it's fascinating. I was just in a Home Depot the other day, Congressman, and the thought of the company's politics, or the executives who run the company's politics, or even the people who work in the store's politics, it never actually crossed my mind. But we find ourselves in a situation in which groups, social justice organizations, and now faith leaders, Congressman, are pushing a boycott of Home Depot, simply because that retailer refused to join other organizations like Coca-Cola and Delta and the Major League Baseball in condemning Georgia's new election law.
Yeah, I think overall it's wise for businesses to stay out of politics. That's a no-win situation for them if they jump in one way or the other. Now, they certainly have the right to do so if they want, but it's wiser, in my opinion, not to, because if they jump into the political arena, they're going to make at least half the people out there angry at them. I think I had a serious conversation with many leaders of Coca-Cola the other day and brought up to them, just name me one thing about the Georgia law that is restrictive to voter access. They could not name a single thing. They're just jumping on the bandwagon because it's they I suppose don't want to be caught up in the cancel culture movement and have protests against them. And so they're just joining in, bashing something that has no validity whatsoever to it. Listen, I applaud Home Depot for staying out of this. That's the right decision. If people want to boycott their silence, they certainly have the right to do so. But I would ask those faith leaders, what about this bill is restrictive to voting access? It expands voting access. The only thing that it restricts is cheating. And both sides of the aisle ought to celebrate the lack of cheating and the prohibition of cheating when it comes to voting. We want a level playing field so that only legal ballots are cast and only legal ballots are counted. That is the voice of the American people in our political system. And if we destroy that in any shape, form, or fashion, our entire country suffers.
In talking about policing, I often try to point out, Congressman, that if you look at an issue that might be hotly debated in the country, I try to look at what is being assumed, and I've pointed out that we're having this conversation about policing in this country in the corporate media, social justice organizations, leftists on news broadcasts. They're talking about it under the assumption that the police are the bad actors. I mean, the White House, responding to the Columbus, Ohio shooting, blamed police violence. They said that phrase twice in the White House statement. And so when I look at the voter law in Georgia, and I've had these conversations, Congressman, with people, and it is assumed that it makes it harder, specifically for black people, to be able to comply with the law. And I'm asking, well, okay, is it the ID? Well, you can go and get just a free ID card. Well, and then the pushback on that, Congressman, is, well, they might not be able to afford it. Well, I say it's free, and I say it again. I don't know if it's lost on you. That is a bigotry that people operate under, because to say that a black person is incapable of doing that, getting a free voter ID, and then if they can't make it to their precinct to vote, putting a photocopy of that ID in their ballot before they mail it or drop it off to one of the supervised drop boxes, that is a bigotry that I think is being pushed by the corporate media and is believed by the people, or held by the people who believe in that this law is somehow suppressing access. Like, you believe it, and it's hard, I think, for people to understand that is a low expectation for sentient adults. It's just bigoted.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, 98% of the people in Georgia voting age have a driver's license. 98%. So we only have in the ballpark of 2% who don't. Most of them are elderly or disabled or whatever, and they're just not able to drive. So there are other means of getting identification, which these people have. As you mentioned, we have free identifications from the state. All they have to go is to a state office and get a state-recognized ID. But even beyond that, there are other forms of ID, the same types of ID that are required to get on an airplane or to even participate in things like Social Security or Medicaid, all these other programs that most of these folks, if they're underprivileged, they're already participating in programs which require the same ID, the same identification that would be accepted to vote. They just have to prove who they are. So this argument somehow that having an ID to vote is restricting votes is insanity. What it is doing is securing votes. It's making sure that only legal voters are voting. And again, that's something that we, as all Americans, should cherish and do everything within our power to protect.
We're being joined right now by Congressman Jody Hice, Republican from Georgia. Do you know Maxine Waters, Congressman? I mean, have you sort of spent any time around her?
Well, not of any significant time. Of course, we're colleagues, and so we bump into each other from time to time. But we don't spend a lot of time together.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
I think some of the first things that were brought to my attention about Congressman Waters, the first thing that blew my mind was just that she'd been in public office since 1976, but her comments after the riots in L.A., which 60 people died, 1,000 people injured, and $1 billion in property damage, she essentially couched her statements in a way that would have you believe that she was basically saying, similarly to what she's saying now, is that people rioting is basically understandable because their anger is understandable. And for her to just use words like protesters should be more confrontational. I mean, there are cities like Portland in which Antifa rioters are still attacking private businesses and federal buildings. I mean, they just desecrated and vandalized a Boys and Girls facility, Boys and Girls Club facility. And so that is the reality in which Maxine Waters is making these comments. And in your body, Congress, I mean, I guess there was a vote on party lines to actually hold her responsible for her words.
Yeah, and she, has these excuses when the protest supports something that she believes in, her agenda. But when those of us on the other side stand for free and fair elections, then all of a sudden we're insightful somehow, and they want to, and she herself wants to expel us from Congress or have us experience some other sort of punishment simply for expressing our views openly. But look, Maxine Waters has had this type of thing since, as you brought up, the early 90s at least, maybe even beyond that, where she has been making these insightful, ridiculous, fiery comments. And it is totally inappropriate for a sitting member of Congress to speak to a group of rioters. We're not talking about innocent protesters here.
Yeah.
We're talking rioters, and telling them to get more confrontational. What does that even mean? I mean, what does it look like when you go beyond rioting and get more confrontational? It's just extremely irresponsible, insightful, and I think it is absolutely worthy of censorship or greater punishment, perhaps going now that has failed, maybe ethics charges. I don't know where it goes from here, but there's no way you can allow this type of behavior and rhetoric to take place without calling her hand on it and having some degree of punishment.
No, it's the expectation for responsibility is just so low on the other side of the aisle for you, Congressman. I just don't see that ever actually happening. The only thing I can believe in is that the people are smarter than Maxine Waters would have them believe. Like, I mean, we all know what she meant. More confrontational. Right. There's a couple definitions of the word confrontation. So, but anyway, Congressman, I don't know how you do it, but Godspeed to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jerome. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. Congressman Jody Hice joining us again.